Have you ever made a decision that changed everything? That's what happened to me. If you're enjoying this story of how one unexpected proposal transformed 2 lives, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about love, courage, and the moments that define us. I still remember the look on Sarah's face when I said those words. We'd only been dating for 3 months. Her apartment lease was ending, and she was stressed about finding a new place in this impossible housing market. I hadn't planned it. The words just tumbled out over coffee on a rainy Tuesday morning, "Move in with me." Her spoon clattered against the mug. Those hazel eyes widened with disbelief, then narrowed with suspicion. "You're not serious," she said. But I was. Dead serious. And that's where our story really begins. We met at a friend's gallery opening. Sarah stood alone, studying a particularly abstract painting with such intensity that I couldn't help but approach. "What do you see in it?" I asked. She turned, surprised, and said, "Chaos trying desperately to become order." I knew then she wasn't like anyone I'd met before. The gallery was crowded that night, full of pretentious art critics and people who seemed more interested in the free wine than the artwork. But Sarah was different. She wore a simple emerald green dress that made her auburn hair glow under the gallery lights. When she spoke about the paintings, her hands moved expressively, punctuating her thoughts. I found myself watching her hands almost as much as her face. We ended up talking for hours, long after my friend, the artist whose work was being featured, had stopped trying to get my attention. Sarah was from a small town upstate, had moved to the city 3 years ago for a nursing position at the Children's Hospital. I told her about my engineering work, my grandfather's apartment, my failed attempts at learning guitar. By the time the gallery owner was politely turning off lights, hinting for the last guests to leave, I'd already asked for her number. Our first date was at a tiny Italian restaurant where the owner knew my name and insisted on bringing us special dishes that weren't on the menu. Sarah laughed when I admitted I'd been going there since I was a kid, that the owner had watched me grow up and still treated me like I was 12. "It's nice," she said, "having roots somewhere." There was something wistful in her voice that made me want to know more. Sarah was brilliant, a pediatric nurse with a talent for calming the most frightened children. She worked impossible hours and still volunteered at a community clinic on weekends. Her apartment was a tiny studio in a building with perpetually broken elevators and a landlord who considered maintenance an optional service. When she mentioned her lease was ending and rents had skyrocketed, I saw the worry lines deepen around her eyes. "I've looked at 15 places this week," she told me over that fateful coffee. "Either they're completely unaffordable or they're so rundown they're practically condemned." One place had actual mushrooms growing in the bathroom. "Mushrooms, Jake." I laughed, but I could see the stress was wearing on her. Sarah had been picking up extra shifts to save for the inevitable security deposit and first month's rent she'd need. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from pushing yourself too hard for too long. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment I'd inherited from my grandfather. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, free and clear. The second bedroom had become a dumping ground for books, sports equipment, and the guitar I swore I'd learn to play someday. As Sarah talked about apartment hunting, something shifted inside me. I realized I wanted her in my space, in my life, permanently. "Move in with me," I said again when she questioned my seriousness. "I have the room. It makes sense." "That's not how men usually think," she replied, stirring her coffee slowly. "Men your age want freedom, space, options. They don't invite women they've known for 12 weeks to move in." I shrugged. "Maybe I'm not like most men." She laughed then, a sound that always made my heart skip. "That's becoming increasingly clear, Jake." The rain intensified outside the coffee shop window, turning the street into a blur of umbrellas and hurrying pedestrians. Sarah watched the rain, her profile thoughtful. I could almost see her mind working, weighing options, calculating risks. "What would it look like?" she finally asked. practically speaking. I hadn't thought that far ahead, but I improvised. The second bedroom would be yours. I'd clear everything out. You could set it up however you want, office, bedroom, whatever. We'd split expenses. No pressure about us. This would be about helping you out of a tough spot, not rushing our relationship. Even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. This wasn't just about helping Sarah. It was about waking up knowing she was there, about coming home to her voice, about building something together. But I didn't say that part out loud. It seemed too much, too soon. Sarah didn't say yes that day. She said she needed to think, which was fair. I respected her caution. Her last relationship had ended badly, a 5-year investment with a man who ultimately couldn't commit. She'd moved to this city for a fresh start, determined to focus on her career rather than another doomed romance. For a week, we didn't discuss it. We went to a movie, had dinner with friends, spent Sunday morning at the farmer's market. Normal couple things. But the question hung between us, unresolved. I didn't push. I wanted her decision to be freely made, without pressure. Then on Sunday afternoon, while we were walking through the park, she stopped suddenly. A street musician was playing something melancholy on a saxophone, and children were feeding ducks at the pond nearby. Sarah watched them for a moment before turning to me. If I move in, we need ground rules. Separate spaces. I pay rent, no arguments. And if it doesn't work, no hard feelings when I leave. I agreed to everything except the rent. We compromised on her covering utilities instead. 2 weeks later, she arrived with 3 suitcases and a box of medical textbooks. I'd cleared out the spare room, painted it her favorite shade of blue, and bought a desk where she could study for her nurse practitioner certification. The day she moved in was awkward. Neither of us knew quite how to act. Were we roommates? A couple? Something in between? I helped carry her things up the 3 flights of stairs, trying not to seem too eager or too distant. Sarah arranged her clothes in the closet with methodical precision, unpacked her books alphabetically by author, and placed a single framed photo on the nightstand, her with an older couple I assumed were her parents. "Are you hungry?" I asked when she'd finished unpacking. "I could make dinner. Or we could order in. Or go out. Whatever you want." She smiled at my nervousness. "Let's order in. I'm too tired to go out, and you shouldn't have to cook on moving day." We ate Chinese food straight from the containers, sitting on the living room floor because I'd never gotten around to buying a proper dining table. Sarah told me stories about her most memorable patients, and I shared office gossip about my coworkers. It felt normal, comfortable. By the time we'd finished the last spring roll, some of the awkwardness had dissipated. That night, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else moving around my apartment. The water running in the bathroom. A drawer closing. Footsteps padding back to her room. The gentle click of her door. It was strange but not unpleasant. Like the apartment itself was coming alive in a new way. The first month was awkward. We bumped into each other in the hallway, apologized for using the last of the milk, and tiptoed around at night. I learned she sang in the shower, always 90s pop songs. She discovered I couldn't sleep without a fan running. Small revelations that slowly stitched our separate lives together. I noticed how Sarah always rinsed her dishes immediately after using them, never leaving them in the sink. How she kept her toothbrush in a travel case rather than leaving it on the bathroom counter. How she would curl up in the corner of the sofa with a medical journal, absently twirling a strand of hair around her finger as she read. Little habits that became familiar, then endearing. There were adjustments, of course. I had to learn to knock before entering rooms I'd always just walked into. Sarah had to adapt to my tendency to leave cabinet doors slightly open. We negotiated shower schedules and thermostat settings. We discovered our different definitions of clean and organized. One night, about 3 weeks after she moved in, I came home late from work to find Sarah asleep on the sofa, a medical textbook open on her chest. She'd been studying for a certification exam, pushing herself to the limit. I carefully removed the book and covered her with the throw blanket my mother had knitted years ago. As I turned to go, Sarah's hand caught mine. "Stay," she murmured, still half asleep. "Just for a minute." I sat on the edge of the sofa, and she shifted to make room, her head coming to rest against my shoulder. 5 minutes later, we were both asleep, tangled together on the too small sofa. We woke at dawn with stiff necks and numb limbs, but something had changed. A barrier had fallen. By month 2, we'd developed routines. Coffee together before her early shifts. Takeout and movies on Thursdays, her choice 1 week, mine the next. Weekend grocery shopping became a joint mission. We argued about brands of pasta sauce and whether cereal counted as a legitimate dinner option. Sarah started leaving her bedroom door open at night. I started cooking meals I knew she liked. We began referring to our apartment rather than my apartment. Small shifts in language that reflected bigger changes in how we saw our arrangement. One evening, I came home to find Sarah had bought a dining table, a simple wooden one with 4 chairs. "I was tired of eating on the floor," she explained, looking nervous, as if she'd overstepped. "If you don't like it, we can return it." I loved it. Not just the table itself, but what it represented, Sarah making this space her own, investing in our shared life. That night, we ate at our new table, using actual plates instead of takeout containers. It felt like a milestone. The first real test came when her parents announced a surprise visit. Sarah panicked. "They're traditional. They'll judge me for living with you. They'll think I'm making another mistake." I offered to stay with a friend during their visit, but she shook her head. "No, they should see the truth. See us." That night, she moved her things into my bedroom. When her parents arrived, we presented ourselves as a serious couple. It wasn't entirely a lie, we were serious, just accelerated by circumstance. Sarah's parents were warm but watchful. Her mother, Ellen, had the same auburn hair as Sarah, though now streaked with silver. Her father, Robert, was tall and broad-shouldered with a handshake that could crush bones. They inspected the apartment with polite interest, asking questions about the neighborhood, complimenting the view from our living room window. "And you two met how long ago?" Ellen asked over dinner at our new table. "About 4 months," Sarah answered, her voice steady though I could see her nervousness in the way she gripped her fork. "And already living together," Robert observed, his tone carefully neutral. "It happened organically," I said, jumping in to support Sarah. Sarah needed a place, I had the space. But it's become much more than a convenient arrangement. Ellen and Robert exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. Later, as Sarah showed her mother our small balcony garden, Robert pulled me aside in the kitchen where I was loading the dishwasher. "You taking care of my girl?" he asked, his voice gruff but his eyes concerned. "I'm trying, sir," I answered honestly. "But mostly, she takes care of herself. I'm just lucky to be along for the ride." He nodded slowly. "Good answer. Sarah's always been independent. Stubborn, too. Gets that from her mother." He paused, looking out toward the balcony where Sarah and Ellen were laughing about something. Her last boyfriend tried to change that about her. Wanted her to be someone she wasn't. "I like who she is," I said simply. Robert studied me for a moment, then clapped a hand on my shoulder. "I believe you do." After her parents left, Sarah didn't move her things back to the spare room. Neither of us mentioned it. Some transitions happen without discussion, a silent agreement between two people learning to trust. Our relationship deepened as spring turned to summer. We discovered each other's histories, piece by piece. Sarah told me about growing up in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, about her childhood dream of becoming a doctor, about the scholarship that had allowed her to be the first in her family to attend college. I shared stories about my parents' tumultuous marriage, about summers spent with my grandfather in this very apartment, about the career path I'd chosen partly to please my father and partly because I genuinely loved solving problems. We had our disagreements. Sarah was meticulously organized, I was more spontaneous. She planned meals a week in advance, I preferred to decide based on what I felt like eating that day. She was an early riser, I was a night owl. But we learned to accommodate each other's differences, to find compromise, to appreciate the balance we created together. 6 months in, we had our first major fight. I'd been laid off from my engineering job, budget cuts, nothing personal, but devastating nonetheless. Instead of telling Sarah, I pretended to go to work each day, spending hours at the library applying for positions and growing increasingly desperate. She found out when a recruiter called the apartment asking for me. "You lied," she said that night, her voice quiet but sharp. "For 3 weeks, you lied to my face every day." "I didn't want you to worry," I explained. "I didn't want you to think I couldn't provide." "Provide?" She threw her hands up. "I don't need you to provide. I need you to be honest. We're partners, Jake. At least, I thought we were." The hurt in her eyes was worse than anger would have been. I'd broken something precious, her trust, out of my own insecurity. Sarah grabbed a pillow and a blanket from our bed. "Where are you going?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "I need space to think," she replied, not looking at me. "I'll sleep in the other room tonight." She slept in the spare room that night. And the next. The apartment felt colder, emptier with that closed door between us. I left for a job interview the second morning, my suit feeling too tight around the collar, my confidence shaken not by the prospect of the interview but by the distance that had opened between Sarah and me. The interview went well, surprisingly well, given my distracted state. The position offered better pay and more responsibility than my previous job. As I walked home, I realized I couldn't fully enjoy this potential good news without sharing it with Sarah. She had become my reference point, the person whose opinion mattered most. On the third night, I knocked softly on the spare room door. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, reading a medical journal. The room still held traces of her presence, books on the shelves, a sweater draped over the chair, even though she'd been sleeping in our room for months. I was ashamed, I admitted. My father lost his job when I was 12. My mother left 6 months later. I've always associated unemployment with abandonment. Sarah set down her journal. "I'm not your mother, Jake. I know. You're better than anyone I've ever known. And I'm terrified of losing you." She patted the bed beside her. "Then talk to me. Even about the scary things. Especially about the scary things." I sat beside her, the mattress dipping under our combined weight. When I got laid off, all I could think about was my father. How he withdrew, became someone else. How my mother couldn't handle it. "I was afraid if you saw me like that, unemployed, uncertain, you might see me differently too." Sarah took my hand, her fingers warm against mine. "I see you, Jake. Not your job title or your bank account. You." She paused, her expression serious. "But relationships don't work without honesty. We can handle hard times together, but only if we're actually together. I had an interview today," I told her. "It went well. But even if it hadn't, I should have told you from the beginning." "Yes, you should have." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "No more secrets?" "No more secrets," I promised. That night marked a turning point. We began sharing deeper fears, older wounds. I learned about her brother's struggle with addiction, how it shaped her need to heal others. She heard about my parents' bitter divorce, my fear of repeating their mistakes. We built something stronger from our broken places. Sarah's brother, Michael, had started using drugs in high school. By the time Sarah was in nursing school, he was in and out of rehab facilities. She told me about the midnight phone calls, the times she'd found him unconscious, the money she'd lent that was never repaid. How she'd learned to love someone while setting boundaries, how she'd discovered her own strength through his weakness.